everyone, and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady, and today I will be doing another general tips and tricks episode. This time we will be discussing what I like to call unethical tactics and how to avoid them. With that said, I do not condone doing any of these things I am about to mention, and instead am making this guide to shed light and to possibly help you from being swindled out of a win in your next 40k gaming experience. With that said, let's get into these unethical tactics that players sometimes use to win games. First things first, let me give you the definition of that guy, since that term will be used a lot in this video. That guy, without sugarcoating it, is an asshole that only has winning on his mind and disregards everything, including rules and ethics. This is different from a regular competitive player, so let me explain the difference. That guy tries his hardest to make sure he wins by gaining unfair advantages, which does include cheating and lying. A competitive player tries to gain advantages in regular means, but does not cheat or lie to do so. It's very subtle, but people often confuse it. I once got called out for being that guy because my opponent forgot something 2 phases ago and I didn't let him go back to fix his mistake. So they think to call me out for being that guy, but technically I am just playing by the rules. For all I know, maybe he wanted to see how his shooting went in his shooting phase before he did any psychic abilities, so he could then decide which psychic abilities were the most advantageous to use. I don't know if my opponent is being sincere or not, so in order to stop them from gaining any unfair advantages, I just stopped the problem at its root by standing my ground. As much as people might not like this, it is fair, and technically what the opponent was trying to do is not fair and can net him some very unfair advantages. So with that said, let's get into the first and biggest tip of this video. If you're not going to watch the whole video, at least listen to this next tip. Number 1, the first tip, be assertive. Some people have more confidence than others and abuse this, especially on timid people, which seems to make up the majority of this community. There are times when things will happen that you and your opponent will disagree on stuff. An example would be, you have a 7-inch charge, but your opponent will fight to the death, saying it's an 8-inch charge. This is when you need to stand your ground and let them know it is a 7-inch charge. Don't cheat. If you notice it's actually an 8-inch charge, then say it's 8. But if you firmly believe it's 7 and your opponent does not agree with you, call a tournament organizer or a TO to settle the dispute. Just threatening to get a TO will usually deter your opponent from trying to further swindle you, because if TOs constantly keep getting called over to deal with this one player, that one player has a chance of being disqualified for unsportsmanlike conduct. Cheating and being unsportsmanlike is against the rules and will be dealt with accordingly by TOs. So normally, just threatening to get a TO will make that guy stop trying to pull some of these swindles on you because he knows that you aren't having it. They normally try to push to see as far as they can go, but if you stand your ground, they won't get anywhere. This also goes with certain things in games like cocked dice. Clearly state at the beginning of the game what constitutes a cocked dice so that there are no arguments. Otherwise, that guy will only say his 1s and 2s are cocked, while anything of yours will count as cocked. Be assertive and talk about the rules ahead of time, because everyone plays certain things differently, like cocked dice. Overall, just be assertive and don't let your opponent take advantage of you. Speak up when you feel wronged or cheated and call a TO if needed. The last thing that guy wants is for a TO to come to the table. So stand up for yourself and do what you need to do. The second tip I'd like to give, which is the other big one, is sometimes your opponent might lie about what their army does. An easy way to avoid this is to ask to see their written list before the game is played. And this is allowed. Everyone's army list is public knowledge. They aren't allowed to hide any unit, and they must explain what their units do if you ask. So nothing technically should be a surprise. With that said, if you ask an opponent what a certain model does, if they do not answer, then call a TO. If they do answer, ask to read the rules anyways to ensure they aren't lying. I always ask to read the rules myself, not because I think my opponent is always lying, but because people are human and make mistakes. Like myself. I once thought Magnus could reroll 1s for armor saves as well as invulnerable saves. This wasn't because I wanted to cheat, it's because I happened to read the rule wrong. So always double check your opponent's rules, because sometimes they might get them wrong and it might not even be on purpose. And going back to rule 1, be assertive and always call a TO if they refuse. The next tip, don't let yourself be distracted. So this is kind of controversial, and I'll get into why after I explain it, but sometimes on your turn, your opponent might ask you tons of questions that seem friendly with no ill intent. Things like, oh, what colors did you use for your army? Or how long have you been playing? Seemingly just making casual conversation. But what he might be doing is trying to distract you so that you have more chances to mess up. An easy way to tell if this is the case is to remember if your opponent was just as talkative during their own turn. If they were, then chances are they just want to have a good time and have no ill intent. But if they only get talkative during your turn, then they are probably trying to distract you so you forget things like your movements, how many shots you get, or even whole phases of the game. I once forgot my movement phase because my opponent kept talking to me too much, and I went right into the psychic phase. I was so salty after that and will never let it happen again. If this is happening, I wouldn't ignore the opponent. Just after a few questions, I would politely mention, "Sorry to cut you off, I don't mean to be rude, but I want to concentrate on my turn so I don't make any mistakes. If you want to have a friendly conversation, I wouldn't mind doing so after the game, but if you don't mind, please let me concentrate on my turn." That's it. Just ask, and for the most part, 99% of people will listen to this. But for that guy, you might have to call a TO. And again, getting a TO called is the worst fear of that guy. So do it if you feel you need to. The next tip is another thing that guy will try to do is fast play you or slow play himself. This is when during your turn your opponent says things like, "Hurry up, come on, time's wasting, the round's gonna be over, let's go," and tries to get you to rush through your turn. Just like the distraction technique I talked about earlier, this technique is also used to cause you to make mistakes, therefore giving your opponent more advantages. Don't let anyone rush you if they try. Again, your best weapon against this is to call a TO. TOs really don't like that guy, and if they get called more than enough for him, they will most likely disqualify him from the event since he is wasting everyone's time by being a bad sport and nobody's having fun against him. To add to this, your opponent might also try to slow play you, which means he thinks that there's a better chance of himself winning if the game doesn't go past X amount of turns. You can easily counter this by writing down the time of when your own turns began and when your turns ended, and also write down the times for your opponent as well. After an hour and a half, if the time is heavily skewed in your opponent's favor, then call a TO to shed light on it, and the TO will be able to do something about it. I might seem like a broken record at this point, but calling a TO is literally the best course of action instead of just letting yourself be abused by your opponent, which I see way too much in competitive play. As a tournament organizer myself, I've noticed many people many times who fail to call a tournament organizer because they're too timid and they just assume that their opponent is being honest with them. Always call a tournament organizer if you have any doubts. They will not be mad at you, trust me, they will be mad at your opponent. So don't feel bad and be like, oh, the TO is gonna hate me because I keep calling them, blah blah blah. No, trust me, they will like you, they will not like your opponent. TOs are on your side, they're not on the cheater's side. So again, if you need to, do not let people walk all over you, call a TO, and be assertive. So with all of that said, let's summarize this video. Most of the stuff I mentioned, and could possibly mention, will usually all end with the same answer. Be assertive and call a TO if needed. That's basically it. I know I kept saying it a lot, but not as many people do it as you would think. So if you need to, again, a tournament organizer will not be mad at you because your opponent is cheating. They will be mad at your opponent, so do not feel bad if you have to keep calling a tournament organizer over because of a unsavory opponent. That's basically it. If you can follow those things, you will lose less games because of your opponent gaming you. Being assertive is hard and takes practice, but trust me, nothing bad will happen from standing your ground. The TOs usually always side with the little guy. As someone who's been playing for 3 years, it's honestly not hard to pick out an honest player from that guy. It really isn't. So TOs can do this too and will always have the back of the person that is right 99% of the time. The TO is on your side and to make sure the game is played fairly for everyone. Also, I might have made it seem like this stuff happens a lot. It really doesn't. In my experience, 9 out of every 10 people play this game by the rules and have no intention of cheating. But there is that one guy out of 10, so I felt the need to mention it. So anyways, I hope I taught you guys something so you can avoid being swindled by that guy in the future, and thanks for watching my video. I'll see you in the next one. Happy wargaming.